big row. And I think that is it. So I'm pleased that Howard's here today. Welcome, Howard Burnham.
Thank you, Terry. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As you see, as Alfred Hitchcock, I've been on a diet. And also got to try and talk through this mask, which is slightly bizarre, but never mind. In your Shakespearean manner, on your imaginary forces work, and please imagine that it's 1940, and we are at the Academy Awards ceremony in Hollywood, or rather we're actually at the celebratory dinner afterwards where Mr. Hitchcock is going to make a speech. So here is the cold water of fear. Alfred Hitchcock arrives in Hollywood.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and in especial, Mr. O'Selznick and Miss Fontane. I wish only that Larry Olivier could be with us, but as you know, he is now serving his country in the European war. Now, I've often been asked what I would like to have engraved upon my tombstone. Invariably, I reply, this is what happens to naughty boys. Thus far, this particular naughty boy has led a charmed life. Born the son of a grocer in the East End of London, my first motion picture here in Hollywood, Rebecca, has just won the Oscar for the best movie of 1940. And at this point, I must thank Mr. O'Selznick, my producer, for bringing me here to America and giving me the opportunity to work with that wonderful box of tricks and treats that is the Hollywood studio system. Back in England, I had to budget production costs to buy a cup of tea. Here, I can order up a teapot, if I so wish, the size and shape of the Taj Mahal. If ever I make a film about India, I shall doubtless do so. I love local color. When I made The Secret Agent set in Switzerland, it had to have mountains and a chocolate factory. If ever I make a movie set in Australia, I shall have my policeman jump into the pocket of a kangaroo and shout, "Follow that car!" I may be new in this town, but I know not what works. Back in England, even my failures made money and became classics a year or so later. So I must ask you, Mr. Selznick, sir, to allow me a free hand to make the kind of movies at which I am best. The thriller. My last two pictures, Jamaica Inn and Rebecca, have been neo-Gothic potboilers from the febrile pen of dear little Miss Daphne du Maurier. But despite the Oscar for Rebecca, they are not exactly my cup of the Taj Mahal. Thrillers are what I excel at. And by thrillers, I don't mean crime mysteries. I don't mean whodunits. 9 times out of 10, it was the butler or the detective. I have little patience with such parlor games, and I leave them to the likes of Miss Agatha Christie. My business, ladies and gentlemen, is simply to scare the hell out of people. And I do so by suspense. After all, there is no terror in the bang, only in the anticipation of it. People like to dip their toe into the cold water of fear. So I simply keep it there as long as I can, as long as they can bear it. making them suffer as much as possible whilst always being mindful that the length of the film should be directly related to the endurance of the human bladder. So, how did I come to have this obsession with fear and the dark side? The child is father to the man. Therefore, let me take you back to 1899 and Leytonstone, just beyond the northeastern sprawl of late Victorian London. Leytonstone was a new lower middle class suburb situated between the slums of London's East End and the still rural region of Epping Forest. Victorian respectability was the hallmark of my family, a family that had pulled itself up by the bootstraps of trade from the squalor of Cockneydom. My father was a greengrocer and poulterer. My mother had been in domestic service. Their desire for social respectability was further strengthened by their deep Roman Catholic faith. I, Alfred Joseph Hitchcock, was their third and final child. My elder brother and sister were senior by several years, so that I was a lonely little fellow, and I very much resented my inferior status in the family hierarchy. I recall that once the senior members of the family were going on a bicycle ride to the Green Man, a public house in Epping Forest. I wanted to go too, but was told that at 4, I was too young and would fall off a bicycle. I replied,
"Them bicycles are stupid. Why not have 3 wheels? That way nobody will fall off."
It was only later that I discovered there were such things as tricycles, and I greatly admired my infant perspicacity. My father was a remote and strict man. My most vivid memory of him was the occasion I had committed a minor indiscretion. He scribbled a note on the back of a shop order sheet and said, "Alfred, take this to the police station at the corner and give it to the duty sergeant." When I did so, the sergeant read it, grabbed me by the ear, "Gotcha!" took me down to the cells, opened one and locked me in. He then slid back the Judas hatch and intoned lugubriously, "This is what happens to naughty, naughty, naughty boys." After 5 minutes, I was released. But that experience has left me with a lifelong dread of the police, combined with a morbid fascination with their methods and procedures. Humiliation and punishment were further embedded into my infant psyche by my Catholic upbringing and schooling. At my boarding school, the good fathers believed in purging our systems as well as our souls. Thus, we were given a strong laxative each night with inevitably messy results. The Jesuit fathers of St. Ignatius College applied frequent corporal punishment with hard leather tawses. But worse was the psychological refinement of giving the victim the choice of the hour of execution: morning break, lunch hour, or after school. Naturally, most put it off to the last moment, and that made it so much worse, as even the boldest spirits were worn down by the attrition of suspense. That was an important object lesson for me making my movies. Being prone from childhood to obesity, I had no aptitude or liking for sports or games. Neither was I a particularly academic child. My greatest accomplishment was to learn all the stops on the Orient Express and recite them to startled relatives at the drop of a hat. My schooling came to an end at 14 with the death of my father. I had some competence with pencil and slide rule, so after training at the London School of Engineering and Navigation, I became a technical clerk at the W.T. Henry Telegraphic Company. The Great War broke out not long afterwards, but I was declared C3, unfit for active duty. Instead, I attended an extramural evening art course at London University. I also began to interest myself in the theatre, the music hall, or vaudeville as you call it, and the new flickers or moving pictures. In an attempt to give myself some sophisticated polish, I took ballroom dancing lessons from a senior employee in the firm, the dapper Mr. Grayson in accounts. It was his great misfortune to be the father of the tragic Edith Thompson. In 1922, Mrs. Thompson, an attractive young abused wife, took a lover, Freddie Bayswater, who subsequently stabbed her husband, Percy, to death. Young Bayswater protested Edith's innocence, but she was charged as an accessory before the fact. It was her misfortune, like Oscar Wilde before her, to encounter the English public in one of its periodic enthusiasms for superficial morality. The result, pretty little Edith with her arms and legs strapped fell through a trapdoor in Holloway prison with 3 feet 4 inches play of rope around her neck. The trial of Mrs. Thompson is one of my favorites, and like the Orient Express timetable, I have it by heart. I have already made a motion picture about an innocent girl accused of murder. You know, one day I would like to make a movie about a beautiful murderess, and perhaps one day I shall. The Great War over, I was transferred at Henley's from technical drawing and accounts to the slightly more stimulating post of graphic artist for the Telegraph and Electric Company, designing technical diagrams and publicity posters. But then, in 1919, 2 events changed my life. The American producer, Jesse Lasky, of the famous Players Lasky organization, the precursor of Paramount, set up a production studio in London. In the same year, the German expressionist movie, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, opened in London, and I saw it. The German director Wiener's celebrated atmospheric exploration of a madman's fantasy in Caligari, that somnambulistic nightmare, gave me such a delicious frisson that I longed to be part of the creative process of such dark excitements. Accordingly, I offered Mr. Lasky my services pro bono as a graphic designer of title cards for the then silent movies. For a while, I moonlighted, designing promotional electrical wiring pamphlets by day and movie title cards by night. Soon, famous players offered me a full-time job, and I was in the business. I learnt the trade from the ground up, eventually becoming an assistant director on one-reelers. But I had other things to learn as well. With my strict lower middle class Catholic upbringing, I was a near total innocent. I did not smoke. I did not drink. I had never walked out with a girl. Senior colleagues at the studio undertook to educate me, at least in the two former activities. I've always enjoyed food. Now I began to appreciate the charms of fine wines, old brandy and choice cigars as vital adjuncts to prandial pleasure. As to girls, I would shift for myself. I had already set my eye on a Titian-haired production assistant at the studio called Alma Reville. She had had much more experience of movies than me, having been assistant to the great D.W. Griffith when he was filming in England. I found her sympathetic and highly intelligent, but I dared not propose to her until I held a superior position to hers at the studio. Alma and I, with the leading British director of the day, Graham Cutts, known as Jack to his intimates, was sent to work at the UFA studios in Berlin because production costs there were cheaper. This was the most important part of my cinematographic education. I already greatly admired the work of the German expressionists like Wiener. Now I met with and studied the techniques of the great F.W. Murnau. He taught me the simple but vital truism. It does not matter what is on the set. What is on the film is what counts. Tricks, Herr Hitchcock. Tricks, tricks, tricks. If your audience believes them, they are not tricks. They are reality. All my life, I've continued to experiment in this great tradition of trickery. One trick, however, that Alma and I could have done without was helping Jack Cutts to cheat on his wife. He was our boss, and we dared not disobey him. A notorious womanizer, he was conducting a passionate affair with an Estonian fan dancer, despite the fact that his wife had come out to Berlin to keep a weather eye on him. We had to assure Mrs. Cutts that we were working late at the UFA studios. Instead, we accompanied Cutts and his dancer to expensive restaurants for lavish meals. Then we sat in the car outside the dancer's apartment while she and Cutts choreographed their bedroom tangos. When we finally returned with the philanderer to his lodgings, we discovered that poor Mrs. Cutts had prepared a substantial late-night supper of steak and kidney pudding for her hard-working hubby and his colleagues. This we dutifully ate on top of our earlier supper. Of course, it did little to reduce my embonpoint. My production work, however, proved satisfactory, and I was advanced to director status in my own right. On our return voyage to England, a squall blew up in the North Sea, and Alma was violently seasick. It seemed to me that this was the ideal time to propose to her, when her resistance was weak. She groaned, nodded her head, and retched. It was one of my greatest scenes, a little weak on dialogue perhaps, but beautifully staged and timed. A month later, we were back on the continent to start my first movie, The Pleasure Garden. It was a truly international affair. The director, myself, was English, the cameraman an Italian, Baron Ventimiglia. the art director German, Horst Bahn, and the star American, Virginia Varley. Our first shoot was to be a series of location sequences in Genoa. But as our train approached the Italian frontier, the Baron explained to me,
Mr. Hitch, a little problem. We must hide the camera and the film. We must, how you say, smuggle these contrabandisti into la bella Italia. My countrymen are so greedy as to impose duties on such items. Pardonica, we place them under your berth in the sleeping compartimento. Then, no problemo.
well, there was a problem. The Customs Carabinieri missed the camera, but found the film and confiscated it. So there we were for my first day shooting as a director up a Genoese creek without a roll of film. I had to borrow money from my cameraman and my star to buy replacement film so I could start my career. The Pleasure Garden passed muster, and I was next given the task of directing The Mountain Eagle, an appalling mishmash that mercifully has disappeared. It was supposed to be set in the mountains of old Kentucky, so we used the Austrian Tyrol. I suffered from alpine nausea, but worse was to ensue. When Miss Nita Naldi, my leading lady from Hollywood, stepped off the train, all of Munich audibly gasped. The heroine of my picture was supposed to be a demure schoolmarm. Miss Naldi was dark, Latin, statuesque, slinky, with oriental eyes, 4-inch heels, and carmine nails longer than a mandarin's. She was dressed in sable furs and accompanied by a black Pomeranian with matching carmine lacquered claws. Her other fashion accessory was the handsome elderly gentleman that she had in tow. She introduced him to me as
My father.
but if he really was her old dada, then I was the Pope's mother-in-law. The third time, lucky. My third movie was a turning point. The Lodger of 1926, based on the Jack the Ripper-inspired novel by Mrs. Bella Lowndes. This was a subject that really interested me. A psychopath is stalking blonde women in the fog-bound streets of London and strangling them. I shot the story in gloomy, atmospheric German expressionist terms, with certain special effects of my own, notably the glass ceiling, where the mysterious lodger's feet are seen pacing the rooms above. You must remember that this was in the days of silent movies. However, my first true movie, subtitled The Story of a London Fog, was very nearly stifled at birth, stifled by the big bad wolf, Mr. C.M. Wolf, a distributor of agricultural implements and seeds, was also, believe it or not, the chief distributor of movies in England at the time. And he didn't like me or my film. He found it incomprehensible and declared, and I quote,
This terror twaddle is as impenetrable as the London fog. It's quite unshowable. There's only one thing to do with such toe rag rubbish. Shelve it.
and so it was for 2 months. Then luckily a film was needed for immediate circulation. And the rest, as they say, is history. The trade paper, the Bioscope declared,
Mr. Hitchcock's The Lodger is the finest British production ever made. A sentiment echoed by the daily and weekly press. Like Oscar Wilde, I was pleased that the critics were entirely of my own opinion. The only weakness of The Lodger, in my view, was its greatest selling strength at the time, namely the performance of the matinee idol Ivor Novello in the title role. I would have preferred an equivocal ending with the audience unsure as to whether the lodger, who had wooed his landlord's blonde daughter away from her policeman boyfriend, really was innocent after all. But the ladies in the audience would never accept "Darling Ivor" as a serial killer. So I had to make him the innocent would-be avenger of his own sister's murder in order to explain his nocturnal wanderings. Despite this fudge compromise, The Lodger made me England's most celebrated director. Incidentally, the tight budget that we worked to made me start a signature practice in The Lodger that I have kept to ever since. We needed an extra in the newspaper office scene. And to save money, I did it myself. I quickly realized the publicity value of the trick. No doubt about it, my movie was a success. And I now felt sufficiently sure of myself and of my position in the film business to marry Alma. A morning wedding in a side chapel of the Brompton Oratory, then off to Paris and San Moritz for our honeymoon. The eventual result was our dearest daughter, Patricia. But we decided that one baby was enough. Their habits are so much at variance with one's own. And we agreed that our future children would be more movies. After The Lodger came a handful of forgettable pot boilers, and my career seemed to be on the skids. But then, in 1928, a double opportunity presented itself. I started work on a project that once again stimulated me, the movie Blackmail, about a girl who kills a would-be seducer and then is subjected to an extortionist's threats. During the shooting of this feature, the Jazz Singer opened in England, and the race was on to produce the first British talkie. I won it by adding dialogue to my in-production picture. There was, however, a problem. My leading lady, Annie Ondra, a delightful blonde whom I liked enormously, was Czechoslovakian. We did some sound tests, but her accent cut like a Schlager saber. Now, Miss Ondra, just say something into this microphone here.
Oh, I don't know what to say.
Well, Miss Ondra, have you had affairs with many men?
Oh, Hitch, you are so wicked. I cannot possibly say that, you naughty man.
Cut. Thank you, Miss Ondra. I think we've got a problem here. The problem was solved by getting an English actress, June Barry, to speak Miss Ondra's lines off camera. It worked, despite the fact that Miss Barry's accent was almost as bad. She had
a Mayfair aristocratic plum in her mouth.
And she was meant to be
A tobacconist's daughter from Bayswater.
Blackmail was not the first, but it was the most memorable of my early cameo signature appearances. I was a subway passenger harassed by the small boy.
Blackmail was a triumph. Mr. Hugh Castle, the leading English critic of the day, who registered enthusiasm for a film about as often as Halley's Comet appeared, gave it a rave notice, quote, "Considering that Mr. Hitchcock is toying with the new medium of sound, about which he knows absolutely nothing, Blackmail, surprisingly, is not a mediocre cinematographic essay. It is perhaps the most intelligent mixture of sound and image we have yet seen. At least we are spared the mawkish vaporizings of Mammy. Altogether, last night's visit to the Hammersmith Picture Palace was not a wholly disagreeable experience for your critic." That, ladies and gentlemen, is an example of an English critic enthusiastically raving. My roller coaster ride of triumphs and troughs continued. I immediately went on a real downer with Elstree Calling, a truly abysmal British response to Hollywood's first musical reviews. It was merely a string of filmed vaudeville acts of ghastly end-of-pier frightfulness, for which amnesia is charity. I reached my lowest ebb with Waltzes from Vienna, a whipped cream confection of Johann Strauss the Younger and Miss Jessie Matthews, a popular British musical theatre star of the day. Like me, Miss Matthews was a Cockney, but she had firmly put all that behind her. She was now
An artiste with several £100 worth of elocution lessons.
insisting on all her grand dame privileges. Right little quota queen, I got my revenge by editing her out of the picture as much as I could. It was at the nadir of my fortunes that I gave an interview to the Daily Herald, which very nearly scuppered my chances of ever coming here to the Hollywood Hills. I was asked if I had any future plans to make films in America, and I replied, certainly not. My policy is to make pictures right here in England, popular pictures which anyone can understand, but without being highbrow. I believe in making films that will appeal to the most intelligent people as well. In Hollywood, it strikes me that the inmates are running the asylum. Luckily, I believe that last remark has been buried in oblivion. After Death on the Danube, as I called Waltzes from Vienna, things took a blessed turn for the better. I formed a partnership with the producer, Michael Balkan, to film a spy melodrama, which turned out to be the first true Hitchcockian thriller, The Man Who Knew Too Much. Its plot of two innocents swept into murderous skullduggery was to be a pattern for several of my movies. It was also full of plot twists and excitements. After all, drama is simply life with all the dull bits left out. It also brought Peter Lorre, a refugee from Hitler's Germany, to be the first of my charming villains. Murder with good manners is always so much more unsettling. Lorre and I enjoyed playing practical jokes on each other. I once inserted a brewery dray horse into his flat, and he reciprocated by sending me 300 singing canaries at 2 o'clock in the morning. The finished movie was once more nearly sabotaged by the big bad wolf. CMW declared it was
utter nonsense, wholly uncommercial. I've said it before and I'll say it again. There is only one thing to do with this kind of toe rag rubbish. Shelve it.
Fortunately, Balkan put pressure on him, and he reluctantly agreed to release it as a B feature. To his impotent fury, it was a smash hit and silenced forever the snarls of the wolf. His huff and puff would not blow my house down. A little story. Two men were traveling to Scotland on a train from London. In the luggage rack above them was an odd-shaped parcel. "What have you got there?" asked one. Oh, that's a MacGuffin." What's a MacGuffin?" "It's a device for trapping lions in the Highlands of Scotland." But there aren't any lions in the Highlands of Scotland." "Well, I suppose it's not a MacGuffin." The point is that a MacGuffin is neither relevant nor important, nor finally anybody's business. It simply gets the story going. It's a favorite device of mine. In The Man Who Knew Too Much, the MacGuffin was an assassination plot. The real story was the kidnapping of the hero and heroine's child. In my next picture, The 39 Steps, the MacGuffin was a secret specification for fighter aircraft, but that is soon forgotten as the two innocents flee, handcuffed together, pursued by both the police and the villains. My stars for this were the handsome and eloquent Robert Donat and the beautiful and intelligent Madeleine Carroll. Miss Carroll was a university-educated British silent movie star who had made a big hit in Hollywood. I feared that she would be puffed up with her American successes. And indeed, I found her to be aloof and cold as an iceberg. So I decided that I would thaw her out. On the first day's shoot, I handcuffed my stars who had never met each other before, and then pretended that I had lost the key. I left them for several hours to make their own bathroom arrangements. I don't think they were amused, though it certainly made the ice-cold Miss Carroll pretty hot and bothered. The movie was another winner, and it owed a lot to Miss Carroll. I'm fond of icy blondes who appear schoolmarmish on the surface, but melt them. Boy, what fires can be started. The success of the 39 Steps was followed by The Secret Agent, in which John Gielgud gave so wooden a performance that he was welcome to return to the legitimate theatre. He'll never amount to anything in motion pictures. Then came Sabotage, where I made the big mistake of blowing up little Stevie with Verloc's bomb. If you're an actor, don't act with children. If you are a director, don't blow them up. Young and Innocent came next, with its famous extended crane shot, traveling the length of the ballroom to unmask the murderer, the blacked up drummer man. And finally, The Lady Vanishes, with Dame May Whitty, Margaret Lockwood, and Michael Redgrave making his film debut. Another legitimate actor, but at least he had more lead in his pencil than Gielgud. All these pictures were in the same genre and all were successful. But I was beginning to feel that I had played myself out in the successful but formulaic British mode. I was in danger of becoming trapped in the predictable mold of my own success. However, by now the siren song of Hollywood had penetrated my ear. Mr. David O. Selznick, you, sir, enticed me here with your licorice baits. I visited New York City as your guest for discussions. I fell in love with steak and ice cream at the 21 Club. In fact, I enjoyed it so much I ordered it 3 times that one evening. Delicious. After all, there are 2 kinds of eating: eating for sustenance and eating for pleasure. I eat for pleasure. After protracted postprandial negotiations, I signed a contract to film a feature on the sinking of the Titanic. After all, I told a New York reporter, I've had experience of icebergs. I directed Miss Madeline Carroll. However, before starting my new life in Hollywood, I was still under contract in England to film Jamaica Inn. Daphne du Maurier's tale of Cornish wreckers in the Regency period is just the kind of costume tashery that I loathe. The only thing that interested me in the story was the split personality of the villain, a charming country squire by day and a murderous wrecker by night. The star who took the role was probably the most difficult man with whom I have ever worked. Mr. Charles Lawton played the two-faced villain with melodramatic bravura, all right, but his temperamental delays as he felt his way into his part were insufferable. I told him, Charles, this isn't Shakespeare. Your role is pure nonsense in a shameless melodrama. All you have to do is do it.
Hitch, dear boy, I know what you say is true, but I am an artiste. I have to feel it. I must find the right physical presence. Let me go and emote in my caravan. There's an angel.
After several days emoting, it came to him.
Hitch, Hitch, wonderful news. It has come to me at last. I have the key to the role. I shall play him like a naughty little boy who has just wet his pants. Let's shoot.
I never said that actors are cattle. I said they should be treated like cattle. You don't direct, Charles Lawton, you referee. Jamaica Inn is not reckoned among my successes. Therefore, it was with some alarm that upon arriving in Hollywood here, I learnt that the Titanic project was to be shelved in favor of a screen adaptation of Miss du Maurier's latest novel, starring Laurence Olivier and Joan Fontaine. I had to use Point Lobos near Carmel to double as the coast of Cornwall. The film proved a triumph, which has won Mr. Selznick this nice little doorstopper. So, Mr. Selznick and friends, that's what this naughty boy's story has been up to now. What more I can do depends on my being given a free hand to build upon and expand my British successes on a bigger, better, and more bountiful American scale. After all, you paid top dollar to get me here. Surely you want to get full value for your money, and to win big, you have to take risks. When I arrived in America, the immigration official looked at my passport visa declaration of employment. Mr. Hitchcock, it says here that you are a director and a producer. What exactly do you intend to produce in the United States?
goosebumps.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. All right, yes. I have about 100+ characters in my repertoire, so I'm jack of all, master of none. But if you want to throw a question at me, I will bluff my way as best I can. Most people, yes, madam. Possibly, there could be a connection with that. There's a possibility, yes. There's a lot to say about birds in part 2 if you can get to it. So come and see me in a couple of weeks or whatever it is. Madam, yes. Yeah, well, a little bit, yes. I know that Olivia was absolutely. Oh, yes, he wants to ask you about the 2 leading actors in Rebecca, about Laurence Olivier and Joan Fontaine. And I know that Laurence Olivier was very unpleasant to Joan Fontaine because he's very upset. He wanted Vivian Leigh to play the part, but Hitchcock and Selznick thought that Vivian Leigh was far too experienced and far too sort of worldly wise and would not project the vulnerability of Max de Winter's wife, whose name escapes me momentarily. And I remember this anecdote that she married Brian O'Hearn during the filming of it. And she very proudly told Olivier that I'm now Mrs. O'Hearn. And Olivier replied, "Is that the best you could do?" Hitchcock said that was very good because it made her terribly vulnerable, like the wife is supposed to be in the film. But Olivier's a wonderful actor, but not a very nice man. Any more? Right, sir. Well, that comes more in part 2, but yeah, I'll talk about that next time. But Hitchcock, yes, and Vertigo's an extraordinary film, and recently it pipped, I think, Citizen Kane as the best movie of all time. I'm sure that Citizen Kane will go back to being the best movie, but any more? That's it, I guess. Okay, well, thank you all very much. And bless you. Thank you. Hopefully see some of you in 2 weeks. Just going to stop the share and whatever we do. Let's get to escape. Exactly.